Hi, welcome again to Talking Sunday Readings. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tim Carter, and I am joined again by Ann Carter and by Pastor Dick Stadler. And we're going to talk about the readings that you might hear if you attend church this Sunday morning. And those readings that you might be hearing this Sunday are from Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 16 to 29. Hebrews 11, 17 to 40, and 12, 1 to 3. And then the gospel lesson this week is going to be from Luke chapter 12, verses 49 to 56. A reading from Jeremiah. A reading from Jeremiah. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Do not listen to what the prophets are prophesying to you. They fill you with false hopes. They speak visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They keep saying to those who despise me, the Lord says you will have peace. And to all who follow the stubbornness of their hearts, they say no harm will come to you. But which of them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see or to hear his word? Who has listened and heard his word? See, the storm of the Lord will burst out in wrath, a whirlwind swirling down on the heads of the wicked. The anger of the Lord will not turn back until he fully accomplishes the purposes of his heart. In days to come you will understand it clearly. I did not send these prophets, yet they have run with their message. I did not speak to them, yet they have prophesied. But if they had stood in my counsel, they would have proclaimed my words to my people, and would have turned them from their evil ways and from their evil deeds. Am I only a God nearby, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them, declares the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? I have heard what the prophets say who prophesy lies in my name. They say, I had a dream, I had a dream. How long will this continue in the hearts of these lying prophets who prophesy the delusions of their own minds? They think the dreams they tell one another will make my people forget my name, just as their ancestors forgot my name through Baal worship. Let the prophet who has a dream recount the dream, but let the one who has my word speak it faithfully. For what has straw to do with grain, declares the Lord? Is not my word like fire, declares the Lord, and like a hammer that breaks a rock in pieces? And we'll just dive right in then with a couple of questions that I had after reading through this lesson from Jeremiah. This passage, I guess, concerns prophets, and God is talking about prophets and bad prophets and people who are prophesying incorrectly. And I am just wondering, what were prophets like back then? I guess I don't really have a good picture of it. Was it a job? Was it one? How did you apply to be a prophet? Did you just stand out in the street and start talking? What can you guys tell us about prophets at the time, and what kind of their role in society was, and how did somebody become a prophet, good or bad?
That's a good question. I'm not so sure that the scriptures give us a definitive answer in every case. We do know that Moses, the prophet of the Lord, was called to service very specifically by the Lord coming through a burning bush. But some of the other prophets were not exactly told how they were called. And Jeremiah tells us in his first chapter that God had ordained him to be a prophet for the Lord already in his mother's womb.
Right.
And so, and how they dressed, we're not told that either. A lot about different prophets and other details like that we'd like to have. Hollywood has probably done more to create our images of prophets from the movies that they've done, like the Ten Commandments and so forth. Anne?
Well, we don't know, but we know that there were schools of prophets. That I understand them as being almost like theology, schools of theology, where you could study what had been already written down. That's my understanding. My other understanding is that if you wanted to, and I'm just gleaning this from context, is that a real prophet was called by God in often odd circumstances, and the people who were called did not really want to do it, but they felt overwhelmed by the Spirit, and bad prophets just took it upon themselves to go out and say, well, God told me to tell you this, and those are the people that God is railing against. I will back up and say that Jeremiah is writing at a time in history when Israel is the kingdom of Israel has fallen, and the kingdom of Judah is under siege and under attack. He writes from 626 to 585. So during that 40-year period, he sees a lot, and he keeps telling everybody that it's happening. You guys have let God down, and now he is leaving you. And there are other prophets there who are saying, no, everything's going to be fine. Everything's good. And Jeremiah keeps bringing people back, saying, you've got to obey God. Otherwise, everything's going to fall apart. And everything fell apart.
And apparently the false prophets were very popular, and they were telling people what they wanted to hear, and that everything was okay and safe, and their behavior was fine. And Jeremiah comes along and throwing sand in the gears. And so he was not well liked, and he was accused of being treasonous because he dared to say Babylon is coming in, and you've got to just concede to them, because this is God's will. This is God's punishment for all the sin that you've committed. And so the other prophets sound very appealing. And in this section especially, it's just forceful law, condemning the false prophets and reminding them, you can't run and you can't hide, because I God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away. In verse 23, can a man hide himself in secret places that I cannot see him? I'll find you out, and don't you dare blaspheme me by speaking things that I did not command you to speak. So it's a very stern rebuke of the false prophet.
Yeah.
But there is some good news in this. There is a gospel section in verse 24, when he says, do I not fill the heaven and the earth? So at the same time that's a warning to the false prophets that God is everywhere, he can find them wherever they try to hide, it's also a comfort to the people of God and to the faithful prophets that God is with them, and that they are not abandoned out there swinging in the breeze when earthly authorities are going after them. So it's got both law and gospel in that little passage. And I don't think we want to so concentrate on the wrath and the punishment that's God's promised, without realizing also there's some encouraging words here too.
Yeah.
Any other questions on that prophet?
I didn't actually.
Okay.
That really kind of took care of that. Not took care of it, but covered all my questions. We're all good to go. I'm going to roll into Hebrews unless either of you had any final thoughts.
A reading from Hebrews. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that is so easily entangled. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, considering him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. All right. So this passage from Hebrews is very interesting, as they all are. But something really stuck out to me here, and it felt familiar in that it begins where he's talking about Abraham and what Abraham went through when God tested him by offering Isaac and all of that. And there's something interesting here. I think it's verse 19, when it's my version says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. I just find this idea interesting that he's sort of making a conjecture as to Abraham's state of mind here. And it's something that I feel like, I don't know, I guess I do when I read these, that you're assuming things, or whenever we have our conversations, I'm often wondering if, conjecture, I guess, kind of making assumptions about what Abraham is thinking and what his state of mind was, during these stories. And I'm wondering, is he making these assumptions? Is this part of a tradition that the Jewish tradition is that Abraham was, knew these things or said these things because of, things that he knew? Anyway, it felt familiar. And I found it interesting that even back then they were kind of making conjectures about what was going on in Abraham's head. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if there's any. I don't even know if there is a question there. I started wondering and kind of lost.
I think you're pointing to a really important point here.
Yeah.
And I would be reluctant to call it a conjecture. I'd call it a revelation, because the advantage we Christians have is that our New Testament scriptures are a commentary on the Old Testament scriptures. And one of the hermeneutical or interpretative principles is let scripture interpret scripture. And when you read this interpretation of Abraham's internal thinking, that he had a confidence that if he had to go through with the sacrifice of his miracle child, God would somehow raise him up from the dead, so he wouldn't really lose him. And then God could still keep all the promises that he's going to have many descendants through Isaac, that he's going to have blessings through Isaac. You go back to the Hebrew text of Genesis, and you see the hints that are in the text that are signal this very teaching, where Abraham leaves the servants at the bottom of Mount Moriah, and he says, the boy and I are going to go up and worship, and we will come back to you. He doesn't say, I will come back to you, assuming that the boy's going to be dead and left up there on the mountain. He's going to bring his son alive back down the mountain. And now Hebrews confirms that. And without that insight, we would miss maybe the point that's right in the text of Genesis. And that's why we have a certain advantage that the Jews do not have. We've got the New Testament commentary, which is inspired as much as the Old Testament. And so we get insights sometimes through these texts that they don't have access to unless they read the New Testament.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting.
Now, there are Jewish scholars who look at that text of Genesis, and they too recognize that the language hints that Abraham believed that his son was going to somehow survive that sacrifice. But they don't have the advantage of Hebrews, which gives us the insight into what Abraham was really thinking.
Yeah, interesting.
Kind of neat.
Yeah. On a side note, Paul wasn't speaking, or if Paul, the writer of Hebrews, I'm not sure if it was Paul, but the writer of Hebrews was not speaking in a vacuum, because people had been thinking about this for many, many years, hundreds of years. Scholars, rabbis, teachers had been thinking about Abraham and about the whole story of what was Abraham thinking, and they talked about it amongst themselves, and they wrote midrash about that. And so the author of Hebrews didn't make this up on his own, but it was he was able to glean from what other discussions what the truth was, and then could write it down. As we get lots of ideas from centuries of Christian thought, and we can determine, or we can, with prayer, determine who was right, who was wrong, because there were some people who had wrong ideas over the last 2,000 years. But we can decide who was trusting God and who wasn't. And Abraham obviously was trusting God to keep his promises.
But when we read the New Testament commentary on it, I don't think we want to put that in the category of speculation or in hypotheses, because the scriptures remind us that these are fully inspired by the work of the Holy Spirit, who breathed these thoughts into them. And so that puts them in a little bit of a league of their own.
That's true. Yeah.
Some of the cultural expectations or cultural interpretations. What is interesting in this is, do you have another question?
No.
Look at all of these examples that you have here, and they allude to apparently things that the writer of the Hebrews assumes everybody could identify and put names on. But when he gets to verse 37, it says they were stoned, they were sawn in two, and we don't have a Bible story about somebody who was sawed in two.
Oh yeah.
There is a tradition in Judaism that it was Isaiah in a document that was found that was written in the 1st century called the Martyrdom of Isaiah. There's a Christian text which expands on the life of Isaiah, and it says that when they tried to persecute him for his work under King Manasseh, that he hid in a tree, and they sawed the tree in half, and also him. Now that there's another document that wasn't written until 200 called the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud from 2 to 500, and that also has some stories about Isaiah being sawed in half. So this may have been a story that was already available for the writer of the Hebrews to draw upon, and he would just assume everybody knows this story, as well as all these other references he makes to heroes of the faith. And what's common to all of them is that they still didn't fully have what they were looking forward to having by faith, but they would have it eventually, and they trusted they would have it, another kingdom. Yeah, kind of neat.
Yeah.
Anything else in this text that intrigues you?
No, those are my big the big takeaway, I guess, if you want to call it that. Did either of you have any other thoughts before we roll into the gospel here?
The Holy Gospel according to Luke. I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time?
Well, toward the end of this reading, if people get into chapter 12, I think they're going to have the advantage of seeing that Jesus is a wonderful example for us when we have to go through tribulation based on our faith, when people pick on us, when people persecute us, and when people don't treat us very well. Because it says Jesus in verse 2 of chapter 12, who's the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and he now is seated at the right hand of God. And so consider him who endured from the sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And so when we do have to face persecution or discrimination or disfavor from people, we can take heart. We're in good company. We're in the same company that Jesus went through. And his was much more intense, I believe. But the point is, something unusual or weird is not happening to you. This is all part of discipleship.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's good. No, on that note, let's roll into the gospel. And this is a gospel from Luke. And this is a section. Let me see if I can find the exact verse where he talks about this is a pretty well-known verse. I have come to bring fire on the earth. But I've done dividing. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? That's the verse. No, I tell you, but division. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other. And I'm wondering, is this? I don't mean to sound disrespectful or anything, but does he mean this literally? Does he really mean that families are going to be divided? Is this a metaphor about Israel or about the world in some way, that the world is going to be divided, and he's using the family as a metaphor for that? Is this a literal father and mother and son and daughter are going to be split up because of all that, because of what's
I have seen it. I've witnessed it. We had a girl who started coming to our congregation many years ago, and her parents were agnostics, professional agnostics. And when she became a believer in Jesus, she wanted to come to our Wednesday night services during Lent, and they would schedule her supper exactly to conflict with those services. So she had to skip supper in order to come to church. And when the members found out about that, they started bringing supper to her, so she would have her supper and her church. But that's just one example that I've seen over the years of many examples where members of a person's family suddenly become hostile to that person because they have decided to follow Jesus Christ with their life. So I think this is a very realistic prophecy by Jesus of what Christians can experience in their families.
Okay.
And some of us are blessed our families haven't done that, and they've been reinforcing and they've been encouraging, but there's a bunch of Christians, especially in other cultures, where they face hostility of the first order when they become a Christian.
Jesus experienced it himself. He was preaching and his mother and his brothers came and said that he was out of his mind and they wanted to take him away. So the message that he was preaching was something that people couldn't accept. So it was both families would be torn apart by accepting Jesus. But it was also, Jesus was teaching about peace. And he was talking about turning the other cheek in a culture where there was a lot of subversiveness about wanting to overthrow Rome. And Jesus was saying, if you don't follow me, if you follow that path, families are going to be divided, and there will be there will be hatred, there will be fighting amongst families. And I didn't come to bring the kind of peace that you're talking about. Let's overthrow Rome and have our own kingdom. So it was within families, yes, but it was also metaphorical, talking about the nation, that if you don't follow Jesus, if you follow your own path, then there will be problems. And the world, once it recognizes that you are following Jesus, will try to destroy you. They will try to do whatever they can and come after your families to get to you. Following Jesus is not easy. And we have been very fortunate in this country. In my family, in particular, we haven't had big arguments or blowout fights about either politics or religion. But other families, it has been that way, and it's destructive, and it's sad. So,
well, and it brings some challenges to missionaries when they go. For example, in China, I had a friend who was a missionary in Hong Kong, and when a Chinese person would become a Christian, they were still expected to come and sacrifice before the family altar for their loved ones, their ancestors. And if you didn't do that, you were excluding yourself from the family. And so they had a terrible time, and they would have to discuss this with their pastors. And some of the pastors there said, you can't do it, even if it means you're getting kicked out of the family and the family will have nothing to do with you. And there were others who said, well, if all you're going to do is light a candle and place it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you go along with ancestor worship, but God can look in your heart, and it's a way for you to maintain a connection with your family. So maybe you'll have a witnessing opportunity. And so even among Christian pastors, there was not a unified approach to some of these challenges where a person faced being exiled from the family if they became a Christian and they followed Christ and worshiped him, faithfully. So I think it's just one example. I'm sure that many of our world missionaries have plenty of stories to tell where people face that kind of division within their own family over Christ.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I guess you covered my questions. So was there anything else that you had in mind? Anything else you wanted to share before we close it for the day?
Well, that last part of the reading that many people will hear is kind of a puzzling one, where Jesus says, you can interpret the weather properly and understand it, but you don't know how to interpret the present time.
Yeah.
Who's he talking to? Is he talking to the disciples? Is he talking to the non-disciples who were in the crowd? And exactly what's he getting at there? My best guess is that he's trying to say to the people, look, there's going to be hostility, like it or not. And so understand that's all part of what God says is the reality of Christian discipleship for you Christians. For you people who are on the outside, and you say that the tough stuff that comes to Christians is proof that therefore they're believing a lie. That's not true either. You can't interpret that as a proof that Christianity isn't valid. And so there's just a number of different ways of trying to get behind what Jesus is getting at here. I don't know if Ruthie, excuse me, Ann, if you've run into any other explanations for that last part of the reading.
Well, again, if we look at it as the people as a whole, if you've been looking for signs that the Messiah is coming, you've been looking for signs, and here I am, and you can see that I fulfill the prophecies, and you don't recognize that I am in your midst. You can tell when a storm is coming, and you can see that the deaf can hear and the dumb can speak, and all of the things that the Old Testament said Messiah was going to do. If you can't recognize that, you're a hypocrite, because you think you're so smart. Well, if you're so smart, you will recognize who I am. It's an encouragement that believe in your heart that I am who I am. But come on, you guys, don't be stupid about it, I guess. If I can put those kinds of words in Jesus' mouth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything else before we close for the day then? Cool. I think that was a good final thought there. Thank you both for your insights and for sharing. Thank you all for watching us today and for joining us for our conversation. We do appreciate you watching and joining us, and any comments you have to share, any questions you'd like to ask, please put them in the comments or let us know. Please like and subscribe and share this with friends and family that you think might get something out of it. We look forward to seeing you again next week on Talking Sunday Readings. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.